And it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening. Andrew M. Ferguson is chairman of the United States Federal Trade Commission. Mr. Ferguson was nominated by President Joe Biden in 2023 to serve as a member of the 5-member Federal Trade Commission and was then selected by President Donald Trump to chair the commission in January of 2025. Before this, Mr. Ferguson was Solicitor General of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and prior to that, he served as Chief Counsel to Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, the then Republican leader of the United States Senate. He also served as a Republican counsel on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee and practiced law at several law firms in Washington, D.C. Chairman Ferguson earned his undergraduate degree and law degree from the University of Virginia. And after law school, he clerked for Judge Karen L. Henderson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and also for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Now, the mission of the Federal Trade Commission is, quote, to vigorously enforce the law to protect Americans from anti-competitive, unfair, and deceptive business practices without unduly burdening legitimate business activity. And they do this through a combination of law enforcement, advocacy, research, and education. So you may be asking, why in the world has a group like the North Carolina Family Policy Council invited the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission to speak at our event? Like Mitch said, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked, and I'm going to answer it for you. Last summer, I had the privilege of hearing Chairman Ferguson speak at 3 separate events during 3 consecutive weeks in the month of July. The first event was a day-long workshop the FTC held in Washington, D.C. on the dangers of gender-affirming care for minors. At this event, the FTC was essentially examining the administration of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and the performance of gender surgery on minors as an unfair and deceptive trade practice. The next week, I heard Chairman Ferguson at Alliance Defending Freedom's annual summit in Orlando, Florida, speaking about child welfare and parental rights. And then the next week, he was at our annual Family Policy Council conference in Indianapolis, highlighting a number of incredible pro-family advancements that had been championed and implemented during the first 5 months or so of the current presidential administration. And I will tell you, in each instance, I was incredibly impressed and encouraged by what I heard. And frankly, I was blown away that it was the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission who was, in many respects, leading the charge on a number of our core issues from the standpoint of our core values. I said to myself then, we have got to get this guy to come speak at one of our events because he has so much important to say. And I'm so glad that we have been able to accomplish that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for being with us this evening. Please come forward and share with us about your very important work at the Federal Trade Commission. Friends, Andrew Ferguson.
Good evening. I promise, notwithstanding my July speaking schedule, that I do work other than speaking. But I'm really grateful for that kind introduction, and I want to thank John for that introduction, and I also want to thank Mitch for inviting me to speak to you all this evening and for organizing this incredible event. For over 35 years, the North Carolina Family Policy has faithfully served North Carolina's families, and it has done so with an unwavering commitment to the biblical values that inspired our nation's founders and our entire civilization and led them to adopt a constitution that is the envy of the world. This event pays homage to those famous words penned by Thomas Jefferson, which speak to our equality as creatures and our inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We would do well to recall that these words were written in a spirit of defiance against tyranny. But tyranny has many forms, and it is not exclusive to kings. We can find tyranny in the collusion of private companies and public officials to silence your dissent. We find tyranny in the oppressive mandates of regulators and bureaucrats. And we find tyranny in the exploitation of children online, in school, and in medical clinics. Tyranny is nothing more than the abuse of one's power to subordinate the interests of many to the ideology or profit of a few. Above all, however, tyranny stems from a rejection of those truths that our founders believed were self-evident, and of any truth that might restrain the perverse will of the tyrant. The tyrant will not submit to what is true. He denies the force of reason or of right because he interprets freedom as license, as power, as indifference to good and evil. For the tyrant, as Pope St. John Paul II explained not so long ago, the essence of freedom becomes self-love, carried to the point of contempt for God and for neighbor, which leads to an unbridled affirmation of self-interest and refuses to be limited by any demand of justice. Without obedience to the truth about God and man, the truth about man and woman, and the truth about virtue and vice, human freedom becomes the means of our enslavement. Rather than a path to flourishing, it becomes a cage of confusion, of libertinism, and of relativism. The only kind of human freedom that can be the foundation of a healthy republic such as ours must be anchored in the truth about our purpose as creatures, whose earthly mission is to steward God's creation, to make it plentiful, and to fill it with many more souls devoted to God. Indeed, true freedom is not found in our mere capacity to prefer and pursue one option over another. Apes and lesser animals enjoy that freedom. True freedom consists in our capacity to choose what is good and true, to pursue our own flourishing, or as Jefferson and his fellow patriots called it, happiness. In the hereafter, when we meet God face to face, we will no longer be able to choose anything other than him, and yet our freedom will be beyond present comprehension. If we live our earthly life in obedience to the truth that is the answer to Pontius Pilate's question posed in the Gospel according to St. John, what is truth? We will be truly free because we will have a heart and will set on union with God, who is all truth. I have stressed here the important connection between freedom and truth. And I did so because tonight's topic illustrates how a person's freedom to choose the good, in many cases, depends on whether others are truthful about content and consequences of someone's choice. Nowhere is this more evident than in the life-altering medical procedures, which, for good reason, our society has always required to depend on the informed consent of the patient. But the informed consent of the patient is meaningless if surgeons, nurses, psychiatrists, and medical associations misrepresent or altogether admit the possible risks and benefits of a procedure to a patient. You all, I'm sure, are familiar with the all too common story of children and parents who underwent so-called gender-affirming care. Lured by the promise of a fail-safe cure for all their mental health problems and kept in the dark about the permanent and irreversible effects of medical transitioning, these young people and their parents were coaxed to open their minds, their hearts, and their wallets to the miraculous healing powers of puberty blockers, hormone injections, and sex change surgeries. There's only one problem. It isn't true. And that's not from me. That's a quote from someone else. That's a quote from The Atlantic, written by the same reporter who had previously accused the Trump administration of carrying out a, quote, nasty campaign, end quote, on this issue. Indeed, mainstream press outlets like the New York Times and The Atlantic now acknowledge that the scientific consensus on which these health claims were based, particularly the claim that that parents with gender-distressed children faced a choice between suicide or sex change surgeries, was based primarily on politics and not science. And litigation against the Biden administration by the state of Alabama revealed that federal officials, including Rachel Levine, were encouraging medical groups to write guidelines favoring pediatric sex change procedures, even as those groups acknowledged a lack of evidence that such procedures were good for children. This was a shocking and unforgivable betrayal of your children by our government. Europeans have a few decades of empirical evidence to offer us on this too. A 2020 report on gender identity services commissioned by the UK's National Health Service, called the Cass Report after its author, found no evidence to support the claim that puberty blockers improved a child's body image or gender dysphoria. No evidence to support the claim that gender-affirming treatment or sex hormone injections reduced a child's risk of suicide. And no evidence to support the claim that social transition in children led to positive mental health outcomes. And most importantly, the report did not find sufficient evidence to support the claim that gender-affirming care, puberty blockers, or sex hormone injections had a positive effect on the psychological well-being of patients. This point was driven home all too clearly when Justice Alito asked an ACLU lawyer in in the Scrimeti case whether there was any evidence that these procedures reduced the risk of suicidality, and the lawyer, obliged by his duty to be honest with the court, had to answer no. Since the publication of that report, and thanks in large part to efforts of organizations like the North Carolina Family Policy Council, as well as the election of our president, Donald Trump, we've seen tremendous movement on this front. Just 1 week after his inauguration, President Trump issued an executive order declaring that the federal government will no longer fund those treatments and instructed the Department of Health and Human Services to rescind or amend all policies that rely on standards of care promoted by the World Professional Association of Gender Health, or WPATH. In keeping with the President's order, HHS has issued 2 proposed rules that would prohibit Medicaid and Medicare from funding hospitals that perform or for individuals electing to undergo that care, including puberty blockers, sex change hormones, and surgical operations. In addition, HHS published a comprehensive review of all of the available evidence and best practices for pediatric gender dysphoria, which formed the basis for Secretary Kennedy's recent declaration that, quote, sex-rejecting procedures for children and adolescents are neither safe nor effective as a treatment modality for gender dysphoria, gender incongruence, or other related disorders in minors, and therefore fail to meet professional recognized standards of health care. Outside the federal government, more than 25 states have passed laws prohibiting such procedures for children, and the Supreme Court decisively affirmed in Scrimeti the constitutionality of such laws. In state courts across the country, there are over 20 cases involving detransitioners who allege that they were victims of medical malpractice by their physicians and therapists. One such much-watched case in New York, a jury awarded Fox Varian, a detransitioner who underwent a double mastectomy at the age of 16, a $2 million award in damages because her therapist and surgeon did not follow accepted standards of medical care in treating her gender dysphoria. Soon thereafter, the American Medical Association and the American Society of Plastic Surgeons announced their new conclusions that such procedures should not be performed on children or minors, citing the low quality of the evidence that these procedures are effective at all, as well as concerns about their long-term harms for children. In the face of these developments, even the New York Times published an article acknowledging that the scientific consensus that had prevailed in the United States was generated by medical associations as a political matter, without evidence to support it. Under this administration, we are witnessing a present-day reckoning, both inside and outside of government, for those who have tricked or unfairly treated children and families under the auspices of medical care. And that's where my role as chairman of the Federal Trade Commission comes to bear on this issue. Whether children, their parents, or adults seeking so-called gender-affirming care were deceived about its efficacy, its benefits, and its risks. Consistent with the FTC's authority under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act to prosecute deceptive acts or practices, we've taken steps to investigate whether claims made by proponents of so-called gender-affirming care are misleading or deceptive, and whether such claims have been the cause of consumer harm to parents and to children. This past July, the Commission convened a groundbreaking workshop that gathered detransitioners, their parents, medical professionals, legal experts, and whistleblowers to discuss whether and in what ways those involved in this type of care misrepresent the effectiveness of surgical interventions or otherwise deceive individuals about their purported benefits. Shortly thereafter, we issued a request for public comment on the same issues. And after the public comment closed and we received thousands and thousands of comments, we undertook a major investigation to evaluate whether the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society, or WPATH have made or assisted others in making false or unsubstantiated representations or engaged in unfair practices in connection with the marketing and advertisement of pediatric gender dysphoria treatment. A district court is going to hear a challenge to my investigation against the AAP later this month, and a district court previously enjoined the FTC's ability to implement or enforce our subpoenas issued to WPATH and to the Endocrine Society. But I tell you this, our investigation against those entities will continue nonetheless. Finally, we hired Glenna Goldis, a brilliant consumer protection lawyer, to serve as a senior litigator in our Bureau of Consumer Protection. Many believe that Glenna was fired from her position as an assistant attorney general in New York for her public criticism of activists and clinicians that may have painted a misleading picture of the efficacy of puberty blockers and surgical transitions. At the FTC, Glenna is taking a leading role in investigating potentially false or deceptive claims about healthcare and beyond. In taking these actions, I am not guided by partisan or ideological concerns. As chairman of the FTC, I am not charged with passing moral judgment on anyone's ideology, lifestyle, or medical choices, but I am charged with protecting my fellow citizens from deception. And I am responsible for making sure that those who make claims about the treatment of vulnerable children are held to the same standard we apply to everyone else who engages in commerce. People confronted with the choice of making life-altering changes to their bodies deserve all the facts. They deserve actual evidence, not politics, on whether these interventions are going to improve their lives. They deserve the actual truth, not obfuscation and propaganda on the risks of treatment, especially when the patient is a child, just beginning his or her journey through life. Earlier, I spoke of a present-day reckoning for those who have advocated for medical interventions with apparent disregard for the truth of whether those interventions are safe or even work as intended. And while that reckoning might be necessary for justice, it isn't sufficient for healing. Beyond protecting our young boys and girls from manipulation and deception, we need to foster our nation's commitment to an evidence-based, nonpartisan approach to the care and support of gender-distressed Americans. Such an approach avoids the dogmatism of those who see no differences among gender-distressed people, no alternative pathways to their healing, and no future life for them except one that involves walking the road of surgical and hormonal transition. That dogmatism is caused not only by a certain ideological blindness, but also, and more fundamentally, an unwillingness to listen, to hear the desperate cries of the distress of children who've undergone these procedures and the voices of those who have borne the weight of years of intense suffering and trauma. Even the word science, rather than being true science, has become a shibboleth, a dogma, a magic incantation shouted to silence detransitioners and their supporters. In pursuit of this dogma, in pursuit of a politics of relativism, many have lost sight of the truth. In the end, gender-distressed Americans need what all Americans need, a free society built on fidelity to the truth, where, quote, the cry of those who suffer finds welcome, and listening opens paths toward liberation, making us eager and ready to contribute to building a civilization of love. Those inspiring words come from the Lenten message of Pope Leo XIV, and the society he envisions would not be possible without organizations like this one, which work to promote, preserve, and protect the cornerstone of any authentic civilization of love, families who live out the biblical mandate to be fruitful and multiply, protected and served by a government devoted to their flourishing and to the common good of all. In such a society, every suffering child will find a home to welcome them, a community that supports them, and a society that protects them from predation and harm. And while I am chairman, the FTC will work night and day to protect your families and to promote their flourishing. Thank you for all you have done and will do in service to families of the great state of North Carolina. I look forward to our conversation, and God bless the United States.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for those remarks. Is it surprising to you that the Federal Trade Commission is involved in such an important and critical issue to the children of our nation and to the families of our nation? Thank you for your leadership. We're so grateful for you and the fact that God has clearly put you in a position of such importance for such a time as this. So we're so grateful. And thank you for your willingness to have a conversation, to delve into this and a few other issues a little bit deeper. So, Chairman Ferguson, on the issue of so-called gender-affirming care, from your perspective, how in the world did we get here? Where did we go wrong? And you talk about truth, and obviously what you described is the antithesis of truth. What's been going on with the abuse of children and adults who have legitimate concerns and confusion. But how as a society did we get to this place, in your opinion?
Well, again, I'm so pleased to be here, and the way that I have conceived of this issue in terms of the law that I enforce is that one of the things that the FTC has done the longest, and the FTC is over 100 years old, 111 years old, is that it has gone...
You look great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. A lot of work done, but... is that for decades and decades and decades, the FTC has prosecuted people who make bunk health claims. And I mean from literal snake oil salesmen in the early 20th century to pharmaceutical companies who misrepresented either the risks or the benefits of their drugs. Even the Biden administration, I imagine they regret this now, but even the Biden administration brought claims against companies selling supplements, and they would make all sorts of crazy claims about their supplements, or cures for autism and things like that. And the Biden administration would pursue these cases, and they would win, because this is what the FTC Act is for. One of my predecessor, my extraordinarily left-wing predecessor, put out a press release after one of these victories that said, "This is a reminder to all markets that in America you can't make health claims without strong science to back them." And I said, "Yep, I agree." But I think a consistent theme runs through these sort of junk science health claims that the Commission has had almost a century of experience dealing with, which is they prey on the vulnerable. Snake oil salesmen were not walking down the streets of early 20th century America looking for healthy people or people who had their wits about them or people whose lives were going well. They were looking for people who were in trouble and needed a way out. And it has consistently been the case across the entire American economy that people who are going to deceive someone look for people in a vulnerable position. And if you have not seen the footage, because we recorded the whole thing and put it online, and it's available for free, of our workshop and a panel that I moderated with detransitioners and their parents, there are no more vulnerable people in the world than children who are experiencing gender distress and their parents, who are at their wits' end about what to do for these children that they love more than anything on earth, in the face of a doctor saying it's suicide or surgery. This is just sort of the same sort of story that human history is laced with, which is people preying on vulnerable people in their time of need. And a consistent theme with all the detransitioners that I've ever talked to was that when they went to the doctor in gender distress, they had suffered some sort of horrifying physical or psychological trauma, truly horrifying, something that no human being, much less small children, should have had to deal with. In addition to, in their teenage years, the changes to which puberty has subjected us all. That is the reason that we have focused on this, because if there have been lies being told in those rooms that have led to those now adults going through what they have had to go through and what they will spend the rest of their lives going through, the government has to act. And the answer that I've always gotten, or the criticism I've always gotten from the left on this is, well, this isn't normally what the FTC does. And my answer has been, yes, it is. We do health claims all the time. You just didn't care about these because it was in your politics. And so if anyone has let politics determine outcomes here, it was you for turning a blind eye on this, or in the case of the Biden administration, for actually trying to promote this ideology. I meant what I said when Alabama sued the Biden administration and got access to Rachel Levine's emails. HHS was putting pressure on the medical associations not to follow the Europeans and say that children shouldn't be subjected to this, because it would be bad for the trans movement in states that were adopting laws to protect children from these surgeries. It's unconscionable that that's what HHS is. It is, however, a reminder that elections have consequences. Biden gave you Rachel Levine and Trump gives you Dr. Oz, and it is just a night and day difference in the way that HHS is run. And so to sum up, people are more prone to believing lies when they're in a tough spot. Scammers know that, fraudsters know it, and that the FTC has understood for a long time. And that is why it is so important that we ensure that the light of truth shines in those doctors' rooms in that moment, because those parents and children are the most vulnerable people you can imagine.
Like you said, the video of the workshop that you all held last July, it's remarkable. I actually, in preparation for this evening, went back and watched several hours of testimony that was given by detransitioners, by family members, by physicians, talking about the lies that have been perpetrated across our nation and across the globe, for that matter, on this particular issue. And you can go on the FTC website. I believe it's ftc.gov.
Yep. That's right.
And that video from that workshop is very prominent on the website. It's not difficult to find. And if you just take a little bit of time to listen to the testimonies of these individuals, and the lies that they were told by physicians, by others, it is absolutely remarkable. It's heartbreaking, and it just emphasizes the importance of the work that the FTC, that the chairman is doing, and others who are speaking out against the grain of our culture in many respects to bring truth and light to this issue. And so thank you for that. It is so incredibly important, and it does seem like truth is bringing light to this issue, and that we are seeing more evidence that's coming forth, more individuals whose lives have been forever altered by surgeries and hormone treatments and those types of things, and they are speaking out, and they're really making a difference. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and if you watch the video, skip the speeches at the beginning.
Don't skip yours, because it is it's excellent.
You don't need to hear me. Just watch the first panel. They are now adults, but the children who went through this in a time of just unbelievable distress in their lives. And also, two of the panelists were a father and a son, and a father who just stood between the practitioners of this and his son and said, no, I will not, no. Threaten me all you want, I will not do it. I can't imagine reading, as he was, the stories of state welfare agencies hauling off children of parents who refuse to accede to these sorts of treatments, standing in the breach and saying, not my kid. If you want profiles and courage, both the transitioners who are coming out now to tell us what they went through, and the story of that father who just defied the physicians, who told him over and over the consequences will be dire, and he just kept saying it just can't be the answer. It is worth. I think it's like maybe 45 minutes, that panel. It is worth. It is worth every second. And I think the FTC, we are the consumer protection agency for the federal government, and so a huge proportion of our work is driven by consumer complaints. We have the world's most sophisticated consumer complaint database. It's shared by every law enforcement agency in America, federal and state. They all have access to it. Academics use it too. It is one of the most important ways the federal government keeps track of problems in the economy, because if thousands of complaints about a particular practice comes in, basically our AI monitors alert us and we begin to investigate that problem. And for years, detransitioners were complaining in the sense that I didn't understand what was happening to me. No one told me what this was going to be like. No one warned me about the risks. I don't understand what the benefits were. And my predecessors were just saying, don't care. These are not the kind of complaints we want. And that was one of the main points of this workshop, was so that these people, these Americans, could understand the agency whose job it is to listen to complaints and do something about it hears you. And you have been silenced by the left. You have been ignored by basically every facet of polite society. No more. We're listening. Tell us what's happening, and then we will act.
One of the earliest detransitioners, Precia Mosley, is from North Carolina, from Gastonia, where I was born and raised. And she's one of the individuals who testifies in this workshop and tells about just the horrific story where she was duped by physicians. And when she expressed vulnerability, they just pulled her in and convinced her parents, really brainwashed them into this. And it's tragic, but it's glorious at the same time that she has been willing to come out and sue the physicians in the practice, but also to testify about her experience and to share others and to warn others about it. And again, thank you for providing the forum for such important information, for truth to come forth in such a critical area and issue. Mr. Chairman, you've also assumed a leadership role in taking big tech to task for failing to protect children from the harms of social media and technology. I'm sure everybody can relate to this. It's just, kids are almost born with an iPhone or some device in their hands. It's remarkable. And these devices are having such a significant impact upon them. But the FTC has really taken big tech to task for failing to protect children and also to preserve the fundamental rights that parents have to dictate the upbringing of their children. Tell us a little bit about the work that you all are doing, the initiatives that you have going forth in this area.
You believe it or not, there is only one federal privacy law, one federal online privacy law. It was passed in 1998. It's called the Child Online Privacy Protection Act. The FTC Act protects privacy in some dimensions, but the only time Congress has ever specifically addressed online privacy was in 1998. And it's actually a parents' rights law. And what that law says is internet companies cannot collect your children's data and track their activities online without parents' informed written consent. This law has been around for a long time. Enforcement of it has waxed and waned. When I became chairman, we have a big privacy division within the FTC, and they were a little worried with Republicans coming in that we weren't going to vigorously enforce the privacy laws. And so they came and said, what are your priorities? And I said, find me every COPPA violation you can, every single one from east to west, and let's sue.
And COPPA is?
It's this 1998 law, the Child Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA. Sorry, thank you. I said, find me every one, and we'll sue. We sued Disney and won. We sued Pornhub and won. And we have several COPPA litigations going, and the FTC under me is the first FTC ever, and we're the only federal agency that can enforce this law. We're the first ones ever to, rather than settling a case, take someone to court, and we won the first ever motion in the history of this law. It's almost 30 years old. First ever motion to dismiss, the first actual statement of the law just a couple weeks ago. In this major case that we brought against an internet company that was harvesting the data of everyone from 5 to 13 without telling anyone about it. This has been the most vigorous copper protection or enforcement agenda in American history. And look, Congress is engaged in a healthy, now long debate about child online privacy, child online protection, and privacy generally for people online. And it's important for those big decisions to be settled in Congress and not by some bureaucrat in Washington. But I want to max out the tools Congress has given me to protect children online and to preserve the rights of parents online. And this is personal to me because one of the ways I cut my teeth in the law was when I was Solicitor General of Virginia. And when I became Solicitor General right after Glenn Youngkin became governor, about 4 minutes after he was sworn as governor, I became Solicitor General. In 2022 in Virginia, every school child in Virginia was still required to wear a mask to go to school. 2022. There were kids in Virginia, elementary school kids, who had never seen their classmates' face in a classroom. There were teachers who had never seen their students' faces, ever, anywhere, in 2022. So Governor Youngkin signs an executive order in a couple minutes after he's sworn in. It's like the first thing he does. There's a ceremony, and then he goes off to the governor's mansion, and they do a bunch of executive order signings. President Trump did a lot of these too. It's great. It's one of the ways you set your agenda as the chief executive. And one of them was, no school is permitted to require a child to wear a mask without the parents agreeing to do so, and that parents, as long as they do so in writing, can send their kids off to school and not require them to wear masks. The Northern Virginia schools, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Virginia, there are two Virginias. There's Northern Virginia and everywhere else. I'm from the West in Shenandoah Valley, so I'm from Raleigh, Virginia, but now live in Northern Virginia. And actually, right before the election, my now wife and I were driving back from Raleigh, Virginia, and we did this little game where we counted the election signs on the way in. And before we got inside the Beltway, President Trump was up like 3-1 over Harris. And just driving through my neighborhood, it flipped like 5-3 in favor of Harris. That's what Northern Virginia is. We just sued the Northern Virginia school boards, which are independent under Virginia law. And we took them to court in Loudoun County, which, again, for those of you who aren't familiar with Virginia, is the epicenter of all of the cultural struggles happening in Virginia. I got there ready for a bonanza hearing alongside parents who were represented by their own private lawyer. And then seated behind me, I didn't really realize it until right before the hearing. It was a huge hearing. Right before the hearing was about to begin, were parents and kids who were suspended from school, kids who were seniors who were having their college admission letters revoked because they were now suspended from school. And so we got up there, and the judge walks out, and he's not wearing a mask. And that's okay. He's like pretty far away from us. And we're all in masks because that was the rule. And he sits down, and he goes, "Oh, you can all remove your masks if you want." And we took our masks off, and the lawyer for the parents is one of my closest friends, and I looked at each other, and I was like, I feel pretty good about this now. It was like a 4-hour hearing. Judge leaves the bench, comes back, reads his opinion from the bench, enjoins the schools from, it says everyone has to follow the executive order. They have to, beginning 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, so when kids return to school. All suspended kids have to be readmitted, and all disciplinary records have to be expunged. And so I'm very happy. I'd spent, the original complaint for this case, I wrote overnight in my office because we were still staffing up at the time. I drove it to Northern Virginia from Richmond because Virginia has some archaic filing rules. And so I drove it from Richmond to Northern Virginia to hand it to the clerk to make sure we got it filed in the way that we wanted it filed. So I was very happy about this, but sort of in the detached lawyer way, like big win for my client. This is great. And I turn around, and the parents and kids are weeping because kids are like, I get to go to school. I'm not going to be bullied by these administrators who are locking me in a rubber room for not wearing a mask. I know I'm going to get to go to college. and parents who said, finally, I'm back in charge of my kids' lives, and there's not some faceless bureaucrat tyrant standing between me and my kids and telling them what to do. And that is why, yeah. And that is part of why COPPA enforcement is so important, because it inserts the parent back between the tech platform and the kid. And look, I don't want to tell parents how they're supposed to raise their kids. And I don't want the government to be the mediator between kid and tech platform, because we've seen what happens when big government gets in the room with big tech. It's the worst possible thing that can happen. It means that if you think that the vaccines were unsafe, you don't get to talk online. If you think something weird happened in the 2020 election, you don't get to talk online. And if it means you think that the Hunter Biden laptop wasn't a Russian hoax, you don't get to talk online. So we can't have big tech and big government in the room making these decisions. And so government needs to empower parents. That is President Trump's theory about what child online protection looks like. That's what his theory about what the AI framework is supposed to look like. And that is what the FTC's theory is. Stand next to parents confronting these technologies. Don't replace them, empower them. And that is what COPPA is ultimately about. As long as the government makes sure that COPPA has teeth, we are empowering parents to raise their kids. And the reason that this was so personal to me was because I understood. I recently got married, I don't have any kids yet, but I understood for the first time in a physical way what it's like when the government stands between parents and kids. Government is supposed to stand next to parents to help with kids, and that's what the FTC is doing.
Amen. So, Chairman Ferguson, the FTC has a pretty broad mission, as we mentioned earlier. I went on your website earlier today and just printed out a couple of the press releases. I'm going to read the headings of these. FTC Chairman Ferguson advises companies to comply with the Take It Down Act. And maybe you can describe that a little bit. FTC Chairman Andrew Ferguson issues warning letters to CEOs of PayPal, Stripe, Visa, and MasterCard about debanking American consumers based on political or religious beliefs, getting debanked, losing your bank accounts, losing access to these major companies and their services. Obviously, a broad mission for this group. And maybe you could speak to those two things, but also other issues that we ought to be aware of that you're working on.
Take It Down Act is awesome. This is Congress, for the first time since 1998, and it's because of Melania Trump. I mean, I can't overstate this. The Take It Down Act says that it's a crime to post non-consensual intimate images of anyone online, and it doesn't matter if they're real or deepfakes. If you post intimate images of someone without their consent, it's a crime. That's one part. That's what DOJ enforces. And then the part that FTC enforces that goes online in 5 days, I'm looking at my staff, 5 days, is that every tech platform has to create a process for victims of revenge porn, of non-consensual intimate images, to go to that platform and say, take this down. And when they get that request, they have 48 hours to take it and every known duplicate down. And if they don't, you can file a complaint with the FTC and we can enforce. And the DOJ has already successfully prosecuted someone for violating the criminal component of the Take It Down Act. We have been working closely with the First Lady's office, with the rest of the White House, with Congress. We have an unbelievably sophisticated website that we will be rolling out on the day that this law becomes operative that makes filing complaints like unbelievably easy, routes them in the appropriate way so that we know who's not complying with the law and who is, and we can devote our resources accordingly. This is massive. Yes, it's about protecting adults or the victims of revenge porn, but I mean, the main population here is children, because with AI, you can do all sorts of unspeakable things with honest, normal photos that you find on Facebook. And now that's a crime. And now the big tech platforms have to help you take that crap down. And our job is to hold the platforms to account to make sure that they do. This is an unbelievable law. Melania Trump championed it, pushed it through the Senate. Chairman Cruz, it was in his committee, he fought it through, and President Trump said over and over, you get this to my desk, I'll sign it. I was there in the Rose Garden for the ceremony. It was an unbelievable accomplishment, and I am so excited about this thing coming online. This is going to be a huge priority for the FTC. Another thing I want you all to know about, I think one of the most eye-opening things that we all lived through it, but I was in politics dealing with it, was the censorship crisis from 2017, basically until Donald Trump became president for the second time in 2024. And what I mean is, there was a period where if you held a view that was inconsistent with the views of people living and working in Silicon Valley, you weren't allowed to say it. And if you tried to say it online, you were getting thrown off online. And if you made a living holding those views, you weren't going to make a living anymore. And when I was working in Virginia SG's office, the more I saw of this, including when the state of Missouri, under now Senator Eric Schmidt, sued the federal government and said, you, the federal government, have been colluding with the tech platforms to decide what we're allowed to say online. It's a First Amendment violation. He ended up not losing that case. He ended up winning that case. I think he should have. That's a discussion for another day. But all of the stuff he found, all the emails back and forth between big tech and the government came public because they were part of the discovery and they were in all of the motions that got litigated before it got to the Supreme Court. And shocking exchanges of emails between tech executives and the government, where the government would say, I don't like this stuff about vaccines that you're allowing to be posted on YouTube or whatever. And they'd be like, got it, no problem, we'll take care of it. And another thing that was happening that I noticed was that if you had a podcast or a show or a Substack and you wanted to talk about these truths, you had a very hard time getting advertising. No one would advertise next to your podcast. No one would advertise next to your Substack. No one would advertise on your show. And that sounds like, economics. It sounds like wallet stuff. It's not. Because one of the ways that people who think and talk and preach for a living is that people buy advertising, and that's what allows them to get their information to your phone and to your computer. Because they can do it for a living and people will pay to put advertising next to it, and that helps make ends meet. So if you cut off advertising, you're cutting off access to the idea. And when I became chairman, we launched a massive investigation into what I feared was collusion among the major American advertising agencies. And I just said, there's no way. Too many of these conservative talk shows and podcasts and blogs would make money for advertisers if the advertisers were willing to advertise there. I find it very hard to believe that the unwillingness to advertise is a natural, independent decision being made by all these advertising agencies. So we investigated. Sure enough, it wasn't. And 2 weeks ago, I sued all the major American advertising agencies in the Northern District of Texas, and at the same time got a consent decree that prohibits them from using blacklists for 10 years, from using groups that create blacklists for 10 years, and imposes a monitor that they have to pay for within their own companies to make sure they don't keep doing this. And that monitor has to report back to the FTC all the time. And if they are doing it, guess what? I drag them back to court and hold them in contempt. And this was because, this is a huge accomplishment. And this was because I saw and heard and listened to people trying to tell the truth to the American people, who said, there's just no way that there's no one that wants to advertise next to what I'm saying. I'm telling the truth. There's just no way that this is organic. And it wasn't organic. And this is why elections matter. Because the only reason this comes to light is because Donald Trump gets elected and he appoints people and then tells them, go do the right thing. And that is why it took a while. It took me a year to do it. It's hard work. I was sued over this. I was enjoined over this. Didn't stop us. But this is what real leadership looks like, is President Trump getting people in place and telling them, go do what's right for the American people. And that is what we've been doing at the FTC. We've sued to block mergers to protect your pocketbook. We have a lawsuit going because we think that prices were inflated in the housing rental market because of agreements between Redfin and Zillow. I mean, this is what the FTC is all about, is kitchen table issues like rents and housing and groceries. We have cases going in the grocery sphere. We have a rulemaking that's ongoing right now that will require the companies that deliver groceries to people to put the actual price of the delivery on their website when they're telling you what they're willing to give it to you, and not a price that gets inflated with fees as the transaction goes on, and then a new price that you have to pay when you actually get your groceries. That's what we're all about, is making life better for the American people so that American families can flourish and everyone can succeed. Not the elites out in Silicon Valley, not the elites in DC, not the elites in New York. Everybody should have a chance. And that is what America is supposed to be about. The common man and the banker are supposed to be on equal footing before the law. Each of them is made in the image of God. Each of them has the exact same amount of dignity, and each of them will have to answer for all of their deeds in the next life before the throne of justice. And in America, all of that is not supposed to matter. Everyone gets a fair shake, and that's what the FTC under President Trump is trying to do.
Thank you for your leadership. I do have one final question as we wrap up our time together, and thank you again for indulging us. This has been amazing. Kind of on a more personal note, how can we here in Raleigh, North Carolina and surrounding areas support the work that you're doing, the incredibly important work that you're doing at the Federal Trade Commission, but also how can we be praying for you and supporting you in that way?
Well, I really appreciate you asking that. I'm a recent convert to Catholicism. I'm a daily Mass attender, and so I'm a neophyte, as the ancient church would have called me. And so prayer for understanding and wisdom and humility as I begin this walk in my Christian faith would be welcome. I got married about 3.5 months ago, so prayer in the thank you. Prayer in the vocation to which God has called me, which is marriage. Prayer for patience for my long-suffering wife who must deal with me. And prayer for wisdom and discernment and judgment in this job. I am incredibly fortunate to have been given this opportunity, and every day I get to work, I remember that I am here as a servant of 330 million of my fellow countrymen, all of whom have their own unique challenges and difficulties, and that I ought to bear that in mind in every decision that I make, and that I be given that as I walk in this job, that the Holy Spirit, that the Paraclete, that the Comforter, will be with me always, and be that still small voice every time I have to make a hard decision, and not that the voice will be there because it will, but that I have the wisdom and humility to listen.
Amen. Amen. Well, Chairman Ferguson, thank you so much for your time, for being here with us, for sharing from your heart and sharing about the incredibly important work that you're doing. Friends, you heard these prayer requests, and I would just challenge all of us to continue to remember Chairman Ferguson on a regular basis, the important work that he's doing, and the Lord would just use him to continue to protect the children, the families of our great nation, and to use this incredible will, desire, and intellect to fulfill what God has called him to at this time in our nation's history. So thank you. God bless you.
Thank you.